At Mom's funeral, my aunt sneered, "Poor Margaret, she tried so hard with Samantha, but that girl never amounted to anything." The whole family murmured in agreement, turning me into their lifelong cautionary tale. But as we were leaving the cemetery, a sleek black limousine pulled up. The British ambassador stepped out, followed by representatives from 12 nations, their flags displayed proudly on the convoy of cars. They weren't there for my family. They were there for me, honoring 15 years of humanitarian work I had carried out in secret. My relatives' smirks melted into silence, then shock, then something close to terror as they began to realize who I really was. The worst part. Mom had known all along, and the letter she left behind would destroy their world. Before we dive into my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've experienced family betrayal, hit that like button. You're not alone. My name is Samantha Mitchell, and for 34 years, I've been the family disappointment. The cautionary tale whispered about at every Mitchell family gathering. The black sheep whose life choices were analyzed, criticized, and ultimately dismissed by people who claimed to love me. But as I stood in that cemetery, watching my relatives' faces transform from smugness to shock, I realized that the biggest lie of my life was the one I'd been telling myself. That their opinion mattered. That their approval was worth pursuing. That their narrow definition of success was the only one that counted. The funeral service had been everything I expected. Formal, respectable, and completely devoid of who Mom actually was. David delivered a eulogy that managed to mention his law practice 3 times while barely touching on Mom's 40 years of volunteer work. Jennifer organized the reception like one of her corporate events, all visual impact and networking opportunities. Dad accepted condolences with the dignity of a man who'd raised 2 successful children out of 3. 2 out of 3. The phrase haunted every conversation. I should have seen it coming when Aunt Carol approached the podium during the reception. She'd been making pointed comments about my life choices since I was 12 years old. "Margaret was such a devoted mother," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for public declarations. "She never gave up hope on any of her children, even the ones who chose to waste their potential wandering around the world instead of building real careers." Every eye in the room turned toward me. Some faces showed pity, others awkward embarrassment at Carol's tactlessness. But several relatives nodded in agreement, as if this brutal assessment was both accurate and appropriate for a funeral reception. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck. 34 years old, and I was still being treated like the family's greatest disappointment at my own mother's funeral. The broken daughter who'd never learned to follow the Mitchell family playbook for success and respectability. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual combination of hurt and defensiveness, I felt an unexpected calm descending. A clarity that cut through decades of accumulated shame and self-doubt. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was exhaustion from spending the last 5 months coordinating international humanitarian crises while never leaving Mom's bedside. Or maybe it was the memory of our final conversation, when she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered words that had been haunting me for weeks. "There's a letter in my desk drawer," she'd said, her voice barely audible above the hum of hospital equipment. "Read it after the funeral, when they've all shown you exactly who they are one more time. Then you'll understand everything, and you'll know what you need to do." Standing there in that reception hall, listening to Aunt Carol reduce my life to a catalogue of failures and disappointments, I began to understand what Mom had meant. But let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not with today's revelations, but with the moment I first realized that my family's love came with conditions I could never meet. I was 17, sitting in our formal dining room during what Dad called a family strategy session about my college applications. David was home from Harvard Law for spring break, his acceptance letter to a prestigious firm already secured for after graduation. Jennifer had just been accepted to Duke with a partial scholarship, her future in marketing and suburban success clearly mapped out. Then there was me, holding acceptance letters from 3 different universities, none of which impressed my parents. "I don't understand why you're even considering these schools," Dad said, spreading my acceptance letters across the mahogany table like evidence in a court case. "University of Chicago has an excellent business program. Northwestern's journalism school could lead to real career opportunities. But what is this? He held up my letter from American University like it was contaminated. International relations. What kind of job does that prepare you for? I want to work with the United Nations, I said, my 17-year-old voice shaking with a mixture of hope and defiance. Or maybe Doctors Without Borders. I want to help people in crisis situations. The silence that followed was deafening. David actually laughed out loud. Help people in crisis situations. Jennifer repeated, as if I'd announced my intention to become a professional unicorn trainer. Sam, that's not a career. That's a hobby rich people do after they've made their money in real jobs. Mom reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for small children who announce their plans to become astronauts. Sweetie, it's wonderful that you want to help people. But you need to think practically. How will you support yourself? How will you buy a house, start a family, save for retirement? Good intentions don't pay mortgages. But I persisted, and 4 years later, I graduated with honors and a degree in international relations and Arabic studies. My parents attended the ceremony with the resigned air of people watching their child make elaborate preparations for career suicide. The criticism intensified when I took my first job with a small humanitarian organization working in refugee camps. The salary was minimal, the conditions were challenging, and my family was horrified. This is temporary, right? Mom asked during one of our increasingly tense phone conversations. You're just getting some experience before you apply to graduate school for something more practical. But it wasn't temporary. Each assignment taught me skills that business school never could. I learned to coordinate complex logistics under impossible conditions, to navigate cultural sensitivities that could mean the difference between successful aid delivery and dangerous misunderstandings, to remain calm when lives hung in the balance and resources were scarce. When I called home to share news about a successful vaccination campaign that had saved 3,000 children from a measles outbreak, the response was always the same polite disinterest. That's nice, dear. Speaking of success, did you hear that David just made partner? My first major breakthrough came during my 3rd year with Doctors Without Borders. I was coordinating medical supplies in Somalia when a cholera outbreak threatened to overwhelm every healthcare facility in the region. The logistics were nightmarish. Multiple aid organizations working at cross purposes, government officials demanding bribes for transport permits, and medical supplies sitting in customs while children died. But I had an idea. Instead of fighting the bureaucracy, I worked around it. I convinced a group of local women to help distribute oral rehydration packets directly to families, bypassing the overwhelmed clinics entirely. Within 72 hours, we'd established a network that reached 30,000 people. The strategy worked so well that other organizations started adopting it. The World Health Organization published my protocols as a case study. International development experts began requesting copies of my field reports. But when I called home to share the news that we'd saved thousands of lives, Mom's response was predictably lukewarm. That's wonderful, dear. Oh, Jennifer got promoted to senior account executive. She'll be managing their biggest retail campaign. The pattern continued for years. Each professional milestone I achieved was met with polite disinterest and immediate redirection to David's courtroom victories or Jennifer's suburban achievements. When I was invited to speak at a Harvard conference on humanitarian innovation, they were more interested in discussing David's new BMW. When Time magazine featured my work in their international edition, the family conversation focused entirely on Jennifer's kitchen renovation. I started testing their reactions, calling with increasingly significant news just to see how quickly they'd change the subject. I've been asked to brief the Secretary of State on refugee crisis management, I announced during one family conference call. That's nice, honey, Dad replied without pause. David, tell everyone about that celebrity client you can't name. The United Nations is creating a new rapid response position specifically for me, I mentioned during another call. Wonderful, dear, Mom said. Jennifer, weren't you going to tell us about your promotion? It became almost comical, if it weren't so heartbreaking. I could have announced that I'd been appointed Secretary General of the United Nations, and they would have found a way to steer the conversation toward David's golf handicap or Jennifer's book club selection. But the most telling incident happened during my 6th year overseas. I had coordinated the international response to a devastating earthquake in Pakistan, managing resource allocation for 12 countries and over 30 aid organizations. The operation saved an estimated 60,000 lives and became a model for future disaster response protocols. CNN interviewed me live from the field. BBC featured our work in a documentary. The President of Pakistan personally thanked me during a televised address. My photo appeared on the covers of 3 different international magazines, and Harvard offered me a permanent position designing their new humanitarian studies program. When I called home to share the news, genuinely excited for once that they might finally understand the significance of my work, Dad answered the phone with barely concealed irritation. "Samantha, this isn't a good time. We're having dinner guests over, and Jennifer needs help setting up for her housewarming party tomorrow." "Dad, I just wanted to tell you about something important that happened with my work." "Can't it wait? We're entertaining the Hendersons, and you know how Patricia gets when conversations get too heavy. Call back next week." He hung up before I could explain that I'd just helped save 60,000 human lives and been recognized by world leaders for my work. But Jennifer's housewarming party required immediate family attention and coordination. That was the moment I stopped trying to bridge the gap between their world and mine. They'd made their priorities clear, and I wasn't one of them. For the next 9 years, I built an extraordinary career while maintaining the fiction that I was their disappointing, wandering daughter. I completed my doctorate in international development through a joint program with Oxford and Harvard, writing my dissertation on crisis coordination protocols that became required reading at diplomatic academies worldwide. The United Nations promoted me to Senior Regional Coordinator, then Deputy Director of Emergency Response, and finally Senior Humanitarian Coordinator, reporting directly to the Secretary General. I taught graduate courses at Harvard, consulted for the World Bank, and served on advisory committees for 3 different Nobel Peace Prize organizations. My work took me to conflict zones and disaster areas across 6 continents. I coordinated relief efforts for tsunamis, earthquakes, civil wars, and refugee crises. I briefed presidents, prime ministers, and royal families on humanitarian strategies. My contact list included Nobel laureates, heads of state, and leaders of every major international organization. But to the Mitchell family, I remained the aimless daughter who worked for charities instead of real companies, who chose dangerous adventures over sensible stability, who somehow couldn't figure out how to build a proper career like her successful siblings. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but I'd grown tired of fighting for recognition from people who'd already decided I was a failure. Let them think what they wanted. My work was too important to be diminished by their narrow worldview. The secret might have continued indefinitely if not for Mom's diagnosis 5 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, spread throughout her abdomen before anyone noticed the symptoms. The oncologist gave her 4 to 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment. I immediately contacted my UN supervisor to request extended emergency leave, explaining that I needed to be present for my mother's final months. What I didn't tell my family was the magnitude of what I was postponing to be there. The week before Mom's diagnosis, I had been scheduled to brief the UN Security Council on a new humanitarian crisis in East Africa. The following month, I was supposed to lead a joint mission with NATO forces to establish refugee camps in Eastern Europe. 3 different heads of state had requested personal meetings to discuss ongoing crises in their regions. I cancelled everything. Delegated ongoing crises to colleagues. Postponed briefings that had been months in the planning. My supervisor, who'd worked with me for 8 years, didn't question the decision. "Family comes first, Sam," he said during our video call. "The world's crises will still be here when you get back. Take whatever time you need." But my family didn't see the sacrifice. They saw their wayward daughter finally coming home where she belonged, finally learning what really mattered in life. The irony was suffocating. "Maybe this tragedy will teach Samantha about real priorities," Aunt Carol announced at the grocery store, loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. Nothing like a family crisis to show you what's truly important. All that running around the world doesn't seem so exciting when your mother needs you. If only she knew that while she was making proclamations in the cereal aisle, I was coordinating emergency aid to Syrian refugee camps via encrypted satellite phone from Mom's chemotherapy sessions. If she could have seen me managing crisis communications with 15 different countries while never leaving Mom's hospital room, she might have reconsidered her assessment of my priorities. During Mom's treatment months, I maintained my humanitarian work entirely in secret. Early morning briefings before visiting hours began. Conference calls from hospital parking lots during Mom's nap times. Emergency coordination sessions conducted via laptop and headphones while Mom slept through her medication fog. The most intense period came during Mom's 4th month of treatment, when a massive cyclone devastated Bangladesh while she was having complications from chemotherapy. I spent 4 days coordinating the international response while never leaving her bedside, managing resource allocation for 20 countries and 40 aid organizations from an uncomfortable hospital chair. David visited on weekends between golf games. Jennifer stopped by after work twice a week, usually spending more time photographing herself with Mom for social media than actually talking with her. But they both commented repeatedly on how wonderful it was that my flexible job allowed me to be there full time. "It's so nice that your work situation lets you do this," Jennifer said during one of her brief visits, snapping another selfie with sleeping Mom in the background. "The rest of us have real responsibilities we can't just abandon, but charity work is obviously more accommodating to personal emergencies." Flexible. Charity work. As if coordinating international humanitarian aid was a part-time hobby rather than life and death work affecting millions of people. As if my emergency management of the Bangladesh cyclone response, conducted entirely from Mom's hospital room, was somehow less demanding than Jennifer's marketing campaigns or David's corporate legal work. For 15 years, I lived this strange double life. To my family, I was Samantha, the disappointing wanderer, the idealistic daughter who refused to grow up and embrace conventional success. To the international community, I was Dr. Samantha Mitchell, Senior Humanitarian Coordinator for the United Nations, whose contact information was stored in the phones of world leaders and Nobel Prize winners. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family worried about my lack of direction, I was briefing presidents on crisis management. While they fretted about my financial instability, I was earning more than David and Jennifer combined, though I donated most of it to causes they'd never understand. The secret might have continued indefinitely if not for Mom's cancer diagnosis 5 months ago. I immediately requested extended leave from my UN position, cancelling briefings with heads of state and delaying emergency missions that had been months in planning. But my family didn't see the sacrifice. They saw their wayward daughter finally coming home where she belonged, finally learning what really mattered. "Maybe this tragedy will teach Samantha about priorities," Aunt Carol announced to anyone who would listen. "Nothing like a family crisis to show you what's truly important." If only she knew that while she was making grocery store proclamations about my newfound wisdom, I was coordinating the international response to a massive earthquake in Indonesia from Mom's hospital room, managing resource allocation for 15 countries and 23 aid organizations while never leaving her bedside. During Mom's final weeks, she was remarkably lucid and seemed to be preparing for something I couldn't yet understand. She insisted on having long, private conversations with me while sending David and Jennifer on elaborate errands that kept them away from the hospital for hours at a time. "I need them to go handle the insurance paperwork," she'd tell David. "It's very complicated, and you're the only one with legal expertise to navigate it properly. Jennifer, could you coordinate with the funeral home about the service details? You have such wonderful event planning skills, and I want everything to be perfect." These tasks were largely unnecessary or could have been handled by phone, but they gave us uninterrupted time together that I now realize was intentional and precious. During one of these quiet afternoons, she pulled out a thick folder that looked like it had been carefully maintained for years. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice carrying a gravity I'd never heard before. "I know they think we don't understand or appreciate what you do, but I've been keeping track of everything." Inside the folder were newspaper clippings, printed articles from international publications, photographs from humanitarian missions, and even academic papers I'd published. Some articles were in foreign languages, carefully translated and annotated in her precise handwriting. screenshots of news broadcasts featuring my work, copies of commendation letters from world leaders. I was completely stunned. The folder contained documentation spanning my entire career, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by topic. She'd been following my work more closely than I'd followed it myself. "I may not understand all the technical details of what you do," she said, turning pages to show me articles I'd forgotten about, "but I understand that you're making a difference in ways the rest of us never could or would. I've been quietly proud while maintaining family peace, but I've been documenting everything because I knew someday you'd need to see proof of what you've accomplished." She showed me a section devoted entirely to recognition I'd received from international organizations. Letters from the World Health Organization. Commendations from UNICEF. A personal note from a former Secretary General thanking me for my work during multiple crises. "Why didn't you ever tell me you knew?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted you to pursue this work for yourself, not for my approval or anyone else's," she replied. "And because the others wouldn't have understood anyway. They would have felt obligated to pretend interest, and your achievements deserved better than forced enthusiasm." She paused, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made me understand this conversation was building toward something significant. "But there's something else I need to tell you, Samantha. Something I've discovered about this family over the years that you need to know. It's bigger than just their lack of support or understanding." My hands started trembling as I sensed we were approaching territory I wasn't prepared for. "I've been paying attention to more than just your successes," she continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've been listening to their conversations when they thought I wasn't aware. I've been watching their reactions to your achievements. I've been documenting things that go far beyond simple dismissal or lack of interest." She reached into her bedside drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in her careful script. "This contains everything I've learned about what they've been doing behind your back for years. Things that will explain why certain opportunities disappeared. Why specific professional connections were mysteriously severed. Why some of your early career attempts seemed to fail despite your qualifications and dedication." The room felt like it was tilting. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I can't tell you now," she said firmly. "You need to read it after the funeral, when you're alone, after you've seen them display their true attitudes one more time without any influence from me. Promise me you'll wait." She gripped my hand with surprising strength for someone so weakened by treatment. "They're going to show you exactly who they are at the funeral," she whispered. "They always do when they think the audience expects them to diminish you publicly. And when they do, when you've seen their cruelty on full display, then you'll read this letter and understand that it wasn't just cruelty. It was deliberate. It was coordinated. And it was much worse than you ever imagined." Her words sent chills through my body, but she wasn't finished. "The letter contains evidence, Samantha. Recordings of conversations. Copies of emails and documents. Proof of things they did to sabotage your early career attempts. Financial interference you never knew about. Professional undermining that you attributed to bad luck or missed opportunities." I felt like I was falling through space. "What kind of sabotage?" "The kind that makes family members call your potential employers and raise questions about your stability and judgment. The kind that involves intercepting your mail when you lived at home during college breaks. The kind that includes deliberate misinformation spread through social networks to damage your reputation before you even knew you had one." The machines monitoring various aspects of her condition seemed to beep more urgently, as if responding to the intensity of this revelation. "They didn't just dismiss your choices, sweetheart. They actively worked against your success for years, and I have documentation of everything. Bank records showing payments made to discredit you. Email chains discussing strategies to undermine your confidence. Recorded conversations where they celebrated your failures and planned additional interference." I was too shocked to respond. The family I'd spent decades trying to please hadn't just been indifferent to my success. They'd been actively sabotaging it while maintaining facades of concern and disappointment. "But why?" I managed to whisper. "Because your success threatened their narrative about themselves," she said simply. "Because if you succeeded on your own terms, It would prove that their narrow definition of achievement wasn't the only valid path. Because your independence and moral courage made their compromises and limitations look small and selfish by comparison. She closed her eyes, clearly exhausted by the emotional weight of these revelations. "Read the letter after the funeral," she repeated. "After they've shown you their cruelty one more time. Then you'll understand everything, and you'll know what you need to do about it." That conversation happened 3 days before she died peacefully in her sleep, leaving me with questions I couldn't answer and a sealed envelope I was forbidden to open until after witnessing whatever final display of cruelty she'd predicted. Standing in that reception hall now, listening to Aunt Carol's performance, I finally understood what Mom had been preparing me for. This wasn't just about their usual dismissal of my choices. This was about something much bigger, much darker, and much more deliberately cruel than I'd ever imagined. But then the sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted Aunt Carol's speech. Through the reception hall windows, we could see a convoy of black vehicles with small flags mounted on their hoods. International diplomatic plates. Security personnel in dark suits taking positions around the building. The room fell silent as the British ambassador entered, followed by representatives from 12 different nations. They weren't there for condolences. They weren't there for my family. They were there for me. "Dr. Mitchell," the British ambassador said, approaching me with the formal respect reserved for heads of state. "On behalf of the United Nations Security Council, I wanted to personally express our condolences for your loss and our gratitude for your mother's sacrifice in sharing you with the world." My family's faces went through a fascinating progression of emotions. Confusion, then recognition, then something approaching panic as they began to process the implications of what they were witnessing. But this was just the beginning. Because tucked away in Mom's desk drawer was a letter that would reveal truths about the Mitchell family that would shatter their carefully constructed world forever. Little did I know that Mom's final gift wasn't just validation of my choices. It was evidence of their betrayals, documentation of their cruelties, and proof of conspiracies that would make Aunt Carol's funeral speech look like gentle teasing. The letter would reveal that Mom had been recording their conversations for years. That she'd documented every cruel comment, every deliberate exclusion, every calculated attempt to undermine my confidence and sabotage my success. But more than that, it contained evidence of active sabotage. Financial interference. Professional sabotage. Deliberate attempts to destroy opportunities and relationships. They hadn't just been dismissive of my choices. They'd been actively working against me for decades, and Mom had proof of everything. But that's a story for when I finally got home that night, sat down at Mom's desk, and opened the envelope that would change everything I thought I knew about the people who claimed to love me. The worst part. They had no idea what was coming. Standing in that reception hall, watching my relatives' faces transform from smugness to confusion to something approaching terror, I felt like I was witnessing the collapse of a carefully constructed illusion that had defined my entire life. The British ambassador approached me with the formal dignity reserved for heads of state, his entourage of international representatives creating a semicircle of respect around me that my family had never shown in 34 years. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room, "on behalf of Her Majesty's government and the international humanitarian community, I wanted to personally express our condolences for your loss and our profound gratitude for your mother's sacrifice in sharing you with the world during these critical years of global crisis." Every word hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Mitchell. Her Majesty's government. International humanitarian community. These weren't phrases typically associated with family disappointments or wandering daughters who couldn't get their acts together. David's wine glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the polished floor. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. Dad's face went through a fascinating progression of expressions as his brain struggled to process what he was witnessing. But Aunt Carol, who just minutes before had been holding court about my failures and Mom's disappointments, looked like she was having some kind of medical emergency. Her face had gone completely white, and she was gripping the back of a chair as if she might collapse. The French ambassador stepped forward next, speaking in accented English that somehow made his words sound even more official and impressive. "Dr. Mitchell, President Macron asked me to convey his personal condolences and to remind you that the Élysée Palace remains available for the humanitarian summit we discussed last month. France stands ready to support your continued work with displaced populations across the Sahel region. President Macron. Élysée Palace. Humanitarian Summit. Sahel region. I could practically hear my family's worldview cracking and crumbling around them. The German representative was equally formal. Chancellor Merkel wanted you to know that Germany's commitment to the refugee integration protocols you designed remains unwavering, and she hopes to continue collaborating with you on the Eastern European Crisis Response Framework. Chancellor Merkel. Refugee integration protocols. Crisis Response Framework. My cousin Michael, who had spent the entire funeral reception explaining his middle management promotion at a regional insurance company, was staring at me like I'd spontaneously sprouted wings and begun speaking ancient languages. But the Canadian ambassador delivered what felt like the final blow to their comfortable assumptions about my life and achievements. Dr. Mitchell, Prime Minister Trudeau asked me to personally thank you for your work coordinating the Syrian refugee resettlement program. The protocols you developed have become the gold standard for humanitarian integration, and your dedication has literally saved tens of thousands of lives. Tens of thousands of lives. Gold standard. Prime Minister Trudeau. The silence in the room was so complete that I could hear the air conditioning system cycling and the distant sounds of traffic outside. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed to be breathing. I looked around at faces that had spent decades expressing pity, concern, and disappointment about my choices, now struggling to reconcile their assumptions with the reality of international recognition and governmental respect being displayed before their eyes. Then the Japanese ambassador approached, followed by representatives from Australia, Switzerland, Norway, and 6 other nations I'd worked with on various humanitarian crises over the years. Each one delivered personal messages from their heads of government, expressing condolences for my loss and gratitude for my work. By the time the last representative had spoken, my family looked like they'd witnessed some kind of supernatural phenomenon that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. David was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sam, what the hell is going on here?" Before I could answer, my phone started buzzing with incoming calls. The screen displayed numbers with international prefixes and names that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who followed world politics. Secretary General of the United Nations. Director of the World Health Organization. President of the International Red Cross. 3 different Nobel Peace Prize laureates. I looked at the screen, then at my family's stunned faces, then back at the screen. For 34 years, I'd dreamed of a moment when they would finally understand and appreciate what I'd accomplished. But now that it was happening, I felt nothing but a strange detachment. "Excuse me," I said quietly, stepping toward the exit. "I need to take these calls. They're probably wondering where I've been for the last 5 months." The British ambassador nodded respectfully. "Of course, Dr. Mitchell. We'll coordinate with your office to reschedule the briefings you postponed to be with your mother. The world can wait a bit longer for your return, but not indefinitely. Too many crises require your expertise." As I walked toward the door, I could hear my family beginning to whisper frantically among themselves, their voices carrying a note of panic that I'd never heard before. "Did you know about this?" Jennifer hissed at David. "How could I have known?" he hissed back. "She's been lying to us for years." "Not lying," Dad's voice was shaky. "We just never asked the right questions." "Asked the right questions." Jennifer's voice was rising toward hysteria. "She works for charities. She volunteers. She doesn't have a real job." I paused at the door and turned back to face them, feeling calmer than I had in months. "Actually, Jennifer, my annual salary from the United Nations is $1.7 million. I donate most of it to causes you wouldn't understand, but I've never worked for free. I've been earning more than David and you combined for the past 8 years." The number hit the room like a physical slap. $1.7 million. Annual salary. United Nations. "But that's impossible," Aunt Carol finally managed to speak, though her voice sounded strangled. "You live in those terrible places. You work in refugee camps. You don't have a house or a car or anything normal people have. I smiled, remembering all the times she'd lectured me about practical life choices and financial responsibility. I own properties in 7 different countries, Aunt Carol. I have diplomatic immunity in 43 nations. I travel on a UN passport that provides me access most people can only dream of. I've had dinner with every major world leader and most of the royal families. I've addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations 12 times. Each fact was another nail in the coffin of their comfortable assumptions about my failure and their success. I don't drive a car because I have access to governmental transportation in every country I work in. I don't need a traditional house because I have diplomatic residences available worldwide. I don't buy things because when you've seen real poverty, material accumulation becomes meaningless. David, who had spent years bragging about his legal achievements and professional connections, looked like he was having an existential crisis. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How could we not have known?" "Because you never asked," I said simply. "In 34 years, none of you ever asked me to explain what I actually do for work. You made assumptions based on your limited understanding of humanitarian aid, and I stopped trying to correct those assumptions because, frankly, your opinions stopped mattering to me a long time ago." The truth of that statement surprised even me. Somewhere during the last decade of achieving international recognition while being treated like a family embarrassment, I had genuinely stopped caring what they thought about my choices. You decided I was a failure when I was 17 years old, and nothing I accomplished afterward was going to change that narrative. So I stopped trying to change it and started focusing on work that actually mattered. Jennifer was crying now, though I wasn't sure if it was from shock, embarrassment, or the dawning realization of how badly she'd misjudged the situation. "But why didn't you tell us?" she managed between sobs. "Why did you let us think?" "Let you think what?" I interrupted. "Let you think that helping people was less important than managing marketing campaigns. Let you think that saving lives was less meaningful than winning court cases. I tried to tell you for years, but you weren't interested in listening." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my recent call log, showing them the screen. In the last week, while Mom was dying and I was coordinating her care, I also managed emergency response to flooding in Bangladesh that affected 2 million people. I coordinated with 18 different governments to expedite medical supplies to Yemen. I briefed the UN Security Council on the developing refugee crisis in Myanmar. They stared at the phone screen like it was some kind of alien technology. Last month, while you were all worried about Mom's funeral arrangements, I was mediating between NATO commanders and refugee assistance coordinators to prevent a humanitarian disaster in Eastern Europe that could have displaced 500,000 people. The scope of what I was describing was clearly beyond their ability to process, but I wasn't finished. 2 months ago, while Jennifer was planning her kitchen renovation and David was celebrating his latest corporate victory, I prevented an international incident that could have started a war between 2 African nations by coordinating refugee camp placement in disputed territories. Each example was chosen deliberately to highlight the contrast between their suburban concerns and the global crises I managed daily. So no, I didn't tell you about my work because I learned a long time ago that you're not capable of understanding or appreciating it. You live in a bubble of suburban concerns and material achievements, and my work exists on a scale that doesn't fit into your worldview. The room was silent except for Jennifer's quiet sobbing and the sound of Aunt Carol's labored breathing as she struggled to process the magnitude of her earlier comments. But then something occurred to me, something Mom had said about seeing them clearly before reading her letter. This was the moment she'd prepared me for. This was when they would reveal their true character in response to learning the truth about my success. And I was curious to see how they would react. "The question now," I said, moving back toward the center of the room, "is what you're going to do with this information. Are you going to acknowledge that you've spent decades being wrong about me and my choices? Are you going to apologize for dismissing work that's literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives? Are you going to reflect on why you were so invested in believing I was a failure?" I looked around the room, studying their faces carefully. "Or are you going to find ways to minimize and dismiss this too? Are you going to convince yourselves that international recognition doesn't matter because it's not the kind of success you understand? Are you going to find reasons why my achievements don't count? The silence stretched on, and I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they struggled to process this new reality. David was the first to speak, and his words revealed exactly the character Mom had predicted I would see. "This is all very impressive, Sam, but you still could have told us. We're your family. We deserved to know." Deserved to know. After decades of dismissing my choices and expressing disappointment in my path, they deserved to be included in my success. Jennifer nodded eagerly, seizing on David's approach. "We would have been supportive if we'd known. We would have been proud. You shut us out deliberately." They were already rewriting history, transforming their years of dismissal and disappointment into my failure to communicate effectively. They were making themselves the victims of my secrecy rather than acknowledging their role in creating the environment that made secrecy necessary. Aunt Carol, recovering from her shock, decided to join the victim narrative. "We always supported you, Samantha. Maybe we didn't understand, but we were always proud. You made it seem like we didn't care. Always supported me. Always proud. Made it seem like they didn't care." This was exactly what Mom had warned me about. Even faced with undeniable evidence of their years of dismissal and disappointment, they were rewriting the narrative to protect their self-image rather than accepting responsibility for their behavior. But I had one more card to play, one more test of their character that Mom had specifically prepared me for. "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out the sealed envelope Mom had given me. "Mom left me something that might help clarify exactly how supportive you've all been over the years." The sight of the envelope caused an immediate reaction. Dad's face went pale. Jennifer stopped crying abruptly. David took a step backward. Aunt Carol actually gasped out loud. Their reactions were so immediate and intense that I realized whatever was in Mom's letter, they knew it was going to be damaging to their newly constructed victim narrative. "She told me to read this after the funeral, after I'd seen your true reactions to learning about my success," I continued, studying their increasingly panicked expressions. "She said it would help me understand why certain opportunities disappeared over the years, why specific professional connections were mysteriously severed, why some of my early career attempts seemed to fail despite my qualifications." Dad made a movement toward me, as if he was going to try to take the envelope, but stopped when he realized how that would look. "Samantha, maybe this isn't the right time," he began. "Actually, Dad, I think this is exactly the right time," I interrupted. "Mom was very specific about the timing. She wanted me to see your reactions to my success first, then read her letter to understand the full context of our family dynamics." I held up the envelope so they could all see Mom's careful handwriting spelling out my name. "She told me this contains evidence of things you did behind my back for years. Financial interference. Professional sabotage. Deliberate attempts to undermine my confidence and damage my reputation." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the shocked silence of people processing unexpected information. This was the guilty silence of people who'd been caught and were trying to figure out how much trouble they were in. She said she had recordings of conversations, copies of emails, documentation of payments made to interfere with my early career attempts, bank records, phone logs, years of evidence. Jennifer started crying again, but these weren't tears of shock or regret. These were tears of panic. "Mom wouldn't have done that," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She wouldn't have spied on family. Actually, David, according to what she told me before she died, she spent years documenting your conversations and activities because she wanted to protect me and eventually hold you accountable for what you were doing." I looked around the room one more time, noting how their expressions had changed from confusion and shock to guilt and fear. "She said you didn't just dismiss my choices. You actively worked against my success. She had proof of everything." The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with secrets and revelations that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. But first, I had one more question for them. "Before I read Mom's letter and learn exactly what you've been doing behind my back for years, does anyone want to confess?" Does anyone want to acknowledge what you've done and apologize before I discover the full extent of your sabotage? The silence was deafening. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody took responsibility. They were going to make me read every terrible detail rather than finding the courage to confess their actions and ask for forgiveness. That's when everything changed completely. I broke the seal on Mom's envelope right there in the reception hall, with 12 international ambassadors watching and my family frozen in guilty terror. The letter was longer than I expected, written in Mom's careful script across multiple pages, with several additional documents attached. "My dearest Samantha," I read aloud, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "If you are reading this, it means I have passed away and your family has just shown you exactly who they are in response to learning about your success. I hope you weren't surprised by their reactions, because I've been documenting their behavior for 15 years. Dad made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. Jennifer was hyperventilating. David looked like he was calculating legal exposure. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to accept, but you deserve to know the truth about why your early career was so challenging and why certain opportunities seemed to disappear. Your family didn't just dismiss your choices, sweetheart. They actively sabotaged them." I looked up from the letter to see Aunt Carol trying to edge toward the exit, but the international delegation was still present, creating an audience that made escape impossible. "It started when you were in college." I continued reading. "Your father was concerned that your interest in humanitarian work would reflect poorly on the family's reputation in business and social circles. He began monitoring your activities and intercepting your mail when you came home for breaks." "That's not true," Dad protested weakly, but his voice lacked any conviction. "I have copies of 17 letters from organizations that were returned unopened, including 3 job offers and 2 internship opportunities that you never knew existed. Your father kept them in his office safe. I found them when I was looking for insurance documents after his heart attack 2 years ago." The blood drained from Dad's face as I continued reading. 17 intercepted opportunities. 3 job offers. 2 internships. All kept secret to prevent me from pursuing humanitarian work. But the interference escalated after graduation. When you applied for positions with various humanitarian organizations, David used his legal connections to conduct background checks and spread concerns about your stability and judgment to potential employers. "What?" I stopped reading and stared at David. "You did background checks on me." David's silence was answer enough, but Mom's letter provided details. "I have recordings of phone conversations where David contacted your potential employers, expressing family concerns about your mental health and judgment. He suggested that your interest in dangerous humanitarian work indicated emotional instability and poor decision-making." The British ambassador looked visibly disturbed by these revelations, and I could see him exchanging meaningful glances with his colleagues. They were witnessing something that went beyond family dysfunction into active sabotage of humanitarian work. 3 specific job opportunities were lost because of these interventions. The position with Médecins Sans Frontières in 2010. The coordination role with UNICEF in 2012. The field position with the World Food Programme in 2013. Each time, family concerns about your stability were raised during final interview stages. I felt like someone was systematically destroying my understanding of my own life story. Those early career disappointments that I'd attributed to competition and bad timing had actually been deliberate family sabotage. But Jennifer's interference was more subtle and potentially more damaging. She used her marketing connections to create negative online content about you using professional techniques designed to damage reputations without leaving obvious fingerprints. I turned to stare at Jennifer, who was now crying so hard she could barely breathe. "You created negative online content about me." Mom's letter provided the details I never could have imagined. Using anonymous social media accounts and fake professional profiles, Jennifer posted content designed to raise questions about your competence and reliability. She created false stories about family concerns, suggested professional instability, and spread rumors through humanitarian networking groups. The scope of the betrayal was beyond anything I could have conceived. My own sister had been conducting a professional reputation assassination campaign while pretending to be concerned about my career choices. I have screenshots of over 40 posts, articles, and comments Jennifer created across multiple platforms between 2011 and 2018. She used sophisticated marketing techniques to ensure these appeared in search results when potential employers researched your background. Jennifer was no longer just crying. She was making sounds like a wounded animal, and I realized she was having some kind of breakdown as the magnitude of her betrayal was being exposed publicly. But the financial interference was perhaps the most shocking. Your father has been systematically interfering with your banking and credit for years, using his business connections to create financial obstacles designed to force you back into traditional career paths. I looked at Dad, who was now sitting heavily in a chair and looked like he might be having a heart attack. He convinced 3 different banks to deny you credit applications, delayed student loan processing during graduate school, and even interfered with apartment rental applications in several cities to make independent living more difficult. The international representatives were no longer just observers. They were witnessing the systematic sabotage of a UN senior coordinator by her own family members, and their expressions had shifted from diplomatic courtesy to barely concealed disgust. I have bank records showing payments your father made to credit reporting agencies to flag your accounts for additional scrutiny. I have copies of emails he sent to landlords describing you as financially unstable. I have documentation of deliberate interference spanning 12 years. The room was completely silent except for Jennifer's sobbing and Dad's labored breathing. But Mom's letter wasn't finished. The most disturbing discovery came last year when I learned about the coordinated nature of these efforts. They have been meeting regularly to discuss strategies for undermining your career and forcing you to return to conventional paths they could understand and control. You had meetings about me. My voice was barely a whisper. I have recordings of family dinners where they discussed your work dismissively and planned additional interference. I have copies of group text messages where they celebrated your early career setbacks and coordinated responses to your achievements. The technology Mom had been using to document their behavior was apparently more sophisticated than any of us had realized. Most shocking of all, they have been in contact with a private investigator who has been monitoring your activities overseas for the past 5 years, providing regular reports on your work and personal life. A private investigator. I couldn't believe what I was reading. You hired someone to spy on me. The investigator was instructed to look for compromising information that could be used to damage your reputation if your success became too prominent or threatened their narrative about family dynamics. I looked around the room at faces that I'd known my entire life, realizing I'd never actually known these people at all. They weren't just dismissive relatives who didn't understand my choices. They were active saboteurs who had been conducting a campaign to destroy my career and personal life. But wait, it gets worse. The most recent development involved attempts to interfere with your UN position. David has been in contact with individuals who claimed they could raise concerns about your work with UN supervisors, and payments were made for this purpose as recently as 6 months ago. 6 months ago. I stared at David. Mom was dying, and you were trying to sabotage my UN position. The timeline was particularly cruel. While I was taking emergency leave to care for Mom during her final months, my brother was actively trying to destroy the career I'd sacrificed to be present for her treatment. However, these efforts failed because your reputation and performance record were so strong that any anonymous concerns were immediately dismissed as malicious interference. Your supervisors actually contacted me to express support for your family during this difficult time. The irony was perfect. My family's attempts to sabotage me had backfired so completely that UN leadership had reached out to offer support during Mom's illness. But Mom's letter had one final revelation that changed everything. You need to know that I have been quietly working against their efforts for years. I have been providing positive references when contacted by your potential employers. I have been correcting misinformation and providing accurate information about your character and abilities. More importantly, I have been in regular communication with your UN supervisors and other professional contacts, providing insights into your family situation and ensuring that their sabotage efforts were unsuccessful. I stopped reading and looked up at the international delegation, suddenly understanding why they had been so supportive and protective of me over the years. Mom had been working behind the scenes as my advocate and protector. Your success happened despite their interference, but it also happened because I was actively countering their efforts. Every opportunity they tried to sabotage, I worked to protect. Every reputation attack they launched, I helped neutralize. The British ambassador nodded slightly, confirming what I was beginning to understand about Mom's role in protecting my career. But I am dying now, and you will need to protect yourself going forward. This letter serves multiple purposes. It provides evidence of their activities that you can use for legal protection if necessary. It also serves as my final gift to you, the truth about who these people really are. I looked around the room one more time, seeing my family with complete clarity for the first time in my life. They are not people who love you unconditionally. They are people who love controlling you, and when they couldn't control you, they tried to destroy you. Your success threatens their sense of superiority and their narrative about themselves. Now they have been exposed, and you have choices to make about how to proceed. I reached the final page of Mom's letter, which contained her specific recommendations for dealing with this situation. My advice is this: you owe them nothing. You have no obligation to maintain relationships with people who have spent years actively working against your happiness and success. You have no duty to protect their reputations when they have spent years attacking yours. Use this information however you see fit. Share it publicly if you choose. Take legal action if appropriate. Or simply walk away from them forever and build your life without their toxic influence. But do not forgive them simply because they are family. Family members who betray you repeatedly are not family. They are enemies who happen to share your DNA. I love you more than they ever could, because real love supports and protects. Their version of love seeks to diminish and control. Build your life without them, sweetheart. You are extraordinary, and you deserve relationships with people who recognize and celebrate that rather than trying to destroy it. Your proud and loving mother. I folded the letter carefully and looked around the room. The international delegation was clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed, but they remained out of diplomatic courtesy and perhaps concern for my well-being. My family members were in various stages of panic and breakdown. Jennifer was still sobbing hysterically. David looked like he was having a medical emergency. Dad was staring at the floor as if he could disappear through willpower alone. Aunt Carol was pressed against the wall like she was trying to become invisible. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, the British ambassador spoke, his voice carrying careful diplomatic neutrality. Dr. Mitchell, given what we have just witnessed, Her Majesty's government wants to assure you of our continued support and protection. If you need any assistance dealing with this situation, please don't hesitate to contact our embassy. The other ambassadors echoed similar offers of support, making it clear that the international community was prepared to protect me from further family interference. But I had a different response in mind. Thank you all for your support and for witnessing this, I said, my voice steady and clear. I think it's important that people understand what systematic family sabotage looks like, especially when it targets humanitarian work. I turned to face my family directly. David, I want copies of all communications you had with my potential employers. Jennifer, I want documentation of every fake online profile and negative post you created. Dad, I want a complete accounting of every financial interference and every payment you made to sabotage my career. They stared at me in shock, clearly not expecting demands for evidence. You have 48 hours to provide complete documentation. If you don't, I'll be filing police reports for harassment, stalking, financial fraud, and professional sabotage. I'll also be sharing Mom's letter and all supporting evidence with major news organizations, because I think the public deserves to understand how family members can undermine humanitarian work. The threat of public exposure seemed to terrify them more than potential legal consequences. And just so we're clear, I continued, this is the last conversation we will ever have. You are no longer my family. You are people who spent years actively trying to destroy my life and career while pretending to love me. I turned back to the international delegation. Gentlemen, would you mind escorting me from this building? I don't feel safe being alone with these people, given what I've learned about their willingness to engage in surveillance and sabotage. The British ambassador immediately stepped forward. Of course, Dr. Mitchell. Our vehicles are outside. As we walked toward the exit, I could hear my former family members beginning to panic about the implications of public exposure and potential legal action. "Samantha, wait," David called out. "We can explain everything. We can work this out." I paused at the door and turned back one final time. "David, you spent years deliberately sabotaging my career while pretending to be concerned about my well-being. Jennifer, you conducted a systematic campaign to destroy my professional reputation. Dad, you stole opportunities from me and interfered with my financial independence." I looked at each of them individually. There is no explanation that makes any of that acceptable. There is no apology that undoes years of betrayal. There is no working this out. I pulled out my phone and held it up so they could see the screen. "I'm about to call my UN security liaison to report potential ongoing threats from family members. I'm going to recommend that you all be flagged as security risks who should not be allowed near any UN facilities or events." The implications of being flagged as security threats by the United Nations clearly hadn't occurred to them, but it would mean professional and social consequences they couldn't begin to imagine. This is what happens when you systematically betray someone who has more resources and connections than you realized. Your sabotage failed, but now you get to experience the consequences of your actions. I walked out of the reception hall surrounded by international representatives, leaving behind the people who had claimed to love me while spending years trying to destroy everything I cared about. Outside, the British ambassador's limousine was waiting, along with the convoy of diplomatic vehicles that had announced my true identity to a room full of people who thought they knew me. "Dr. Mitchell," the British ambassador said as we approached the vehicles, "I hope you know that what we witnessed in there was not normal family dynamics. That was systematic abuse disguised as concern." I nodded, finally beginning to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. "The international humanitarian community is a family of choice," he continued. "We support each other because we understand the importance of the work. You don't need biological relatives who undermine that work." As we drove away from the reception hall, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Complete, overwhelming relief. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to pretend to care what my family thought about my choices. I didn't have to explain or justify my career. I didn't have to try to win approval from people who had been actively working against me. I was finally free to be exactly who I had become. Dr. Samantha Mitchell, Senior Humanitarian Coordinator for the United Nations, respected by world leaders and trusted with crises that affected millions of people. The people who had claimed to love me had revealed themselves to be enemies. But the people who had chosen to work with me, who shared my values and supported my mission, had proven themselves to be my real family. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I called my UN supervisor to report the security concerns and arrange for protective measures if needed. Then I called 3 different news organizations to schedule interviews about family sabotage of humanitarian work. Finally, I called the Secretary General directly to inform him of the situation and my intention to return to full duties immediately. "The personal crisis has been resolved," I told him. "I'm ready to get back to work saving lives instead of managing family dysfunction." "Welcome back, Dr. Mitchell," he said. "The world needs you, and we're glad to have you back where you belong." Where I belong. With people who understood that saving lives was more important than suburban social status. With colleagues who measured success by impact rather than income. With an international family that supported my mission rather than sabotaging it. 3 days later, my story appeared on the front page of major newspapers around the world. The headline read, "How a Family's Sabotage Failed to Stop a Humanitarian Hero." The article included excerpts from Mom's letter, documentation of the sabotage efforts, and quotes from world leaders praising my work. It became a case study in how family dysfunction can target successful women who choose unconventional paths. My former family members were identified by name and faced professional and social consequences for their actions. David lost several high-profile clients who didn't want to be associated with someone who sabotaged humanitarian work. Jennifer's marketing firm fired her when the story went viral. Dad's business relationships suffered as word spread about his systematic financial interference. Aunt Carol, who had started this entire revelation with her cruel funeral speech, became a social pariah in her community when people learned she had been part of a family conspiracy to undermine international humanitarian work. But the most satisfying consequence was completely unexpected. The story inspired other people to come forward with their own experiences of family sabotage, creating a movement of people who had chosen to build lives beyond the toxic influence of relatives who claimed to love them. I received thousands of messages from people who recognized their own experiences in my story. Adult children whose parents had sabotaged their careers. Siblings whose families had undermined their success. Spouses whose in-laws had worked to destroy their marriages. My story had given them permission to acknowledge that family love is not unconditional, and that sometimes the healthiest choice is to build a chosen family based on shared values rather than shared DNA. 6 months later, I was back in the field, coordinating relief efforts in a refugee camp in Chad. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was David, apparently writing from a new phone number because I had blocked his regular contacts. "Samantha, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that Dad had a heart attack last week. He's in intensive care, and the doctors don't know if he'll make it. I thought you should know, in case you wanted to say goodbye." I read the message twice, waiting to feel something. Concern, guilt, obligation, regret. Some emotional response that would compel me to drop everything and rush to his bedside for a potential deathbed reconciliation. But I felt nothing except a mild curiosity about why David thought I would care about the medical emergencies of someone who had spent years trying to sabotage my career. I deleted the message without responding and went back to coordinating medical supplies for 50,000 refugees who actually needed my help. That's when I knew I had finally, completely healed from the damage they had inflicted. When family emergencies no longer felt like emergencies because they were no longer my family. I had built a better life without them, surrounded by people who understood that love supports rather than sabotages, that family helps rather than harms, and that success should be celebrated rather than destroyed. Have you ever had to choose between maintaining family relationships and protecting your own well-being and success? Have you experienced family members who claim to love you while actively working against your happiness? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below, and I hope my story helps you recognize that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who refuse to stop hurting you, regardless of their biological relationship to you. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about choosing healing over toxic relationships. And remember, the family that matters most is the one that actually supports your dreams instead of trying to destroy them. Thank you for listening to my journey from family sabotage to international recognition. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming everything they tried to prevent you from becoming.